Hey, what's going on? Welcome to Angular Air. I'm your host, Justin Schwarzenberger, and on today's episode, we are going to be talking about Angular AMP, but without AMP. Not quite sure how that works. We're going to find out, though. Looking forward to it. All right, let's say hi to our panelists, and then we'll say hi to our guest, and we'll get things rolling. Joining us today, we've got Bonnie. Bonnie, what's going on?
Whole lot of nada. How you doing?
Doing good.
It's night here.
It's what?
It's night here.
It's night there. All right. Yeah. You're so far away now. And then we gotta. There's
I know,
like this slow transmission, right?
Yes.
Right.
I'm sorry, but I just miss you guys. I have to join anyway.
Oh, we're stoked that you're here for sure. Mike, what's going on, Mike?
Not too much. Amped to be here. Right. Too soon. All right, I got it out of the way though. All right, it's gone, forgotten. All right, cool.
Good one.
Happy to be here, ready to chat.
Nice. And our guest today joining us again, Jeff. What is going on, Jeff? So glad to have you back.
Yeah, not much is going on. Glad to be here. It's always fun to join you guys.
We always love having you here, dropping that knowledge. We're always excited to hear what you got for us next. So. Yeah, for sure. What, do you have anything new going on since we last chatted? I think we just had an episode not too long ago, right?
Yeah. It wasn't too long ago. We're talking about Firestore, which was very fun for me. Something I've been working a lot with. And so launch, a lot of the code that I showed then was for a particular new product that I was building. So we did soft launch it at least, called critic.ly. So there's still a lot more to go with that, and we haven't done like a big official launch yet, but it's out there at least and going well.
Nice. Was there any big snags that came up in terms of what you were talking about last time, and then you discovered once you actually did it, like that was different from what we were talking about?
Yeah. I mean, one follow-up thing that's kind of interesting. I think I mentioned the issue that I was having where in Firestore, when you have your document size is too big, it can lead to some performance issues because it brings back the entire document. You can't select parts of documents. And so I was trying to I was hoping that the Firestore team would make a solution for that, I guess, or whatever. But instead, I knew that wasn't going to happen. So I actually did some database refactoring, a schema design refactoring rather, and updated some stuff to basically put things in smaller collections, and that's been much better now. So at some point I'm gonna do some testing to figure out what that pivot point is of what size where it gets to be an issue. But at least for right now, making the individual document size smaller, now everything is super fast again. So good.
Very nice. Might have to do a post-mortem episode of talking through that.
Yeah, part 2, definitely.
Part 2, right? Yeah, a lot of people I know like that episode, so that's cool. Well, what do we got in store for today?
Yeah, so we're talking about something that it's kind of interesting to talk about because the underlying problem that we'll talk about here with AMP is something that we all face, but I would venture to guess that almost none of you guys and no one listening is actually using AMP for certain reasons that I will get into. So it is a very powerful thing, but it's addressing a huge issue, but it's not necessarily something that people are using today. But I think that we can talk about some ways in which you can potentially either integrate it into your Angular app, or at least use some of the same types of mentality that they use to solve some of these big problems.
Nice. Do we want to talk about what is AMP? What we're talking about there in terms of that concept?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, as an even predecessor to that, let me talk about the problem that it's trying to fundamentally solve. So it's basically instant loading and instant interactivity on low-powered mobile devices, for the web. So it's a big problem that I know you guys know about, and we talk about a lot in the different GDE groups and other tech groups, where on third world countries, and actually even in here when the network connection is not doing well on your mobile device, performance is always an issue, right? So the smaller you can get, the faster you can load, the better. And Angular has a whole bunch of different solutions for that. But it was kind of interesting that in the origins of AMP was a team at Google that started to think about that and started to say, okay, what is the kind of like most extreme thing we can do so that on a consistent basis, everything that matches a particular specification we know for sure that it will instantly load and the user will instantly be able to have interactivity with the page, regardless of what type of network they're on or what type of device they're on or anything like that. So it was a really audacious goal, just like from the problem they're trying to solve. Because I mean, if you think about it, you got to deal with slow server response time, a potentially slow network, and then slow render time, like depending on all of the resources that you have, and bringing in all the images and JavaScript and CSS and all there. So there's a lot of different issues like baked within it, but that is what AMP is focused on, is on that first time page load experience coming from, especially any type of time you go to a particular page, but especially when you're going from Google search results and kind of clicking into a page, they want it to just be there instantly. So does that make sense for like the problem that they're trying to solve?
Yeah. And is it also for the mobile view experience as well? Is that part of it too, in terms of maybe changing the look of the content?
Well, the goal wasn't to necessarily change the look of it per se. It was more to, in fact, they really want you in an ideal world to be able to build things however you want to, at least have it look however you want it to look. But they just want it to appear instantly. So they've basically created this a library to solve this, but moreover a specification that if you follow this specification, then Google will serve your pages up very quickly using a bunch of stuff that we can get into in the details here.
And then is that just the result in terms of the search results from Googling, or is direct link as well?
Well, it would always be fast if you just direct link, but it's specifically built for coming from Google search results. It's like that's where it's even more so, because they can prefetch it and do some other optimizations. So for getting into like the details of this, like I think it's helpful to kind of separate out the kind of specification of like what the concepts of like what they're trying to implement in restrictions in order to accomplish this, and then like the library itself, and then like as a third part I kind of had listed as I was thinking about this is how the Google search engine itself uses AMP, because like you have to implement a whole bunch of stuff, but then they see that and then they do a bunch of stuff on their side. So does that sound good to kind of go over this?
Absolutely.
Okay. So for the specification, there's a couple things that are key. And this is where like I kind of broke things up in this way, because a lot of the specification stuff, in their implementation, they have a lot of specific ways that they decided to do things. But some of these specifications, even if you're building your own Angular app without AMP, like these are helpful to do, like to do any of these. Okay. So one is your web app needs to be 100% cacheable. And what I mean by that is that from the server view side of things, that you need to be able to set it up in a way that an external middleman, like a proxy or a CDN or whatever, can take your entire site and it can serve it by itself, like from that CDN, and it doesn't need to contact the server, unless obviously if there was like a refresh of the content or whatever else, but it doesn't need to. So like that 100% cacheable is like super important. And so again, even if you don't use AMP, that's actually a really good thing to do. Like when you are trying to have a publicly facing app that is search indexed and all that type of stuff. So even if you use just like Cloudflare or CDN or Google CDN or whatever, it's a really good thing to make sure that your app is fully cacheable. And then the other a couple other things, except for CSS. This is one of the things that this particular specification is one of the things that I think leads to a lot of people not wanting to implement AMP with Angular, but it's actually super helpful. So all CSS has to be inlined, and it can only be a max of 50 kilobytes, and it can't be like multiple script tags, it has to be just one. And there's like a couple other like small CSS restrictions. You can't use like the exclamation point important and a couple other small things. So there's like that restriction alone I found is actually really annoying at first, because the way that Angular generates the app, there actually are like first of all, a number of script tags, they aren't inlined, a couple of things like that where it caused some problems. So you basically have to come up with your own way of doing CSS outside of the kind of prescriptive Angular way, which I'm going to talk about near the end. But that's just something to keep in mind for the specification. And then the other thing is images have to be either inlined or lazy loaded. And typically the specification doesn't enforce this, but the recommendation is that you basically are inlining the images that are above the fold. So like a lot of the AMP specification is like optimizing not just for the initial view, but that very first, like the very first frame above the fold that people are viewing, that is like super optimized, and the other stuff like below the fold can somewhat be lazy loaded. So for images, it would inline those images like above the fold, and then they would just have like placeholders below the fold that get lazy loaded once you start scrolling down and that type of thing.
And when we talk about above the fold, we're talking about the viewport of a particular browser or that you're looking at, anything that's essentially off screen, off of that viewport for that device, whatever, right?
Yeah, and it's funny. So just like something like that, I think is one of those things where at least most Angular apps that I've seen, like people don't account for that type of thing. But that actually like helps a lot. Like when you do start optimizing for above the fold, below the fold, like that's like something that isn't built into Angular, but like you can do yourself. Like there's tricks to do it, and it definitely helps with that initial loading and and then
I like the,
what's that, Mike?
Yeah, I like the idea that the restrictions that they're putting in place aren't just arbitrary. They're there to help the end user to have a streamlined and a more efficient experience when engaging with your content. It's not just, we just want to be difficult and try to put additional constraints on you to be able to fall into the paradigm, but to make it worthwhile for the end user experience. I like that.
Yep, definitely. Custom fonts are only allowed from whitelisted CDNs, so you can't actually serve up a custom font from your own server or whatever. They have to have some guarantee that it's going to be served quickly or whatever. So like the Google CDN, there's a couple other ones that are common when people use custom fonts. For HTML, so this is actually another big one that is a restriction and is super annoying for Angular, is that they have a strict, they take the HTML syntax strictly. So like you can't actually just add arbitrary elements and names and attribute names like we do all the time with Angular. And so like there is a lot of the generated Angular code if you don't take certain steps that actually break the AMP specification. So this one is like super annoying. There are some ways around it that I'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, that one's just annoying. And they do that, by the way, there's a reason for all this stuff. They do this, again, to be able to enforce that the page coming back is valid and it's not trying to do something weird with the user. They don't allow iframes, that type of thing. And then for JavaScript, okay, so this is the big one, right? Now this gets into the actual library itself. So the AMP library itself is a web component library, So it's literally just a series of web components. They authored it in React, in fact, but they publish it as just basic web components that you can reuse. And so it's a series of web components to be able to like build your app with. So you can build an entire app just with these AMP web components. Like you could build a whole thing. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, but it's definitely possible. And you can, even if you weren't going to go like full AMP, you can actually, with your Angular app, just use like one or two of these, just like you could use any web component in your code or whatever. And just like one example, something I mentioned earlier about images and like the restrictions for images. So pretty much all of those restrictions, they've created web components to help you like implement the things you have to implement with those restrictions in mind. So for the images thing, for example, they have one of my favorite AMP components that I actually honestly would recommend that you use regardless of whether you're actually trying to do an AMP application or not, is the amp-img, the AMP image web component. So this thing, all you have to do is you include, the reference to the web component, and in the AMP image like declaration, you specify like the URL and you have to give it dimensions. That's one of the things, is that it needs to know, even though it resizes the images, it needs to know at least the dimensions, proportions of the image, so that it basically reserves space on the screen for you, even though it's not showing the image. And it has the code behind the scenes to know whether it's in, so it knows whether to automatically load it right away or to wait until the user starts scrolling and everything like that. So that's like all baked in already to that component. And it's like super useful. So I use that all the time, even when I'm not building an AMP application, just as an example. And then as far as other JavaScript, basically you can't, and this is another big issue, the reason why people don't get turned off from AMP, like when they're doing Angular apps, is that you actually can't directly use any other JavaScript outside of their AMP web components. However, they do have an AMP script component that basically allows you to publish your own web components. So that's the way to get around it, is that you have to, you can't use like the full Angular in its entirety, but you can publish Angular, like use Angular elements to publish your own web components that you then wrap around the AMP script. And there's a couple of just like small restrictions that it script write Angular to be used as a web component within AMP. At least, or any, not Angular, just like any framework, whatever you author a web component and you can use. And so the AMP script will run inside a web worker. So that's how they their whole thing is that with JavaScript, and the reason why they have so many restrictions on JavaScript is that they do not want your JavaScript to modify the page at all until the user interacts with the page. And it actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because when the user, you're trying to get to interactivity as quickly as possible. So the longer that the page, if you guys, I'm sure you guys have done the Lighthouse time series thing, right? Where you see the first paint where you see something, and then it usually takes, maybe that's 3 seconds or whatever is the first paint, but then it usually takes another 7 seconds before the time series in Lighthouse is completely done, because it's JavaScript's adding this thing and that thing as data loads and whatever. And this is where it's a strong opinion on the AMP side. And I tend to agree with this opinion that that's a bad experience, that it's definitely okay once the user starts interacting with the page to start modifying it according to whatever, they click on a button and show something else or whatever. But you should, in that initial server view, have everything for the user to see right away. So that's the way that they get to interactivity, almost instantaneously within a second or two, because it's not actually changing anything from that initial server view. The initial paint is the thing. There is no further need to keep on rendering, if that makes sense.
But the idea of dynamically changing the content like the large majority of Angular applications do. You see some stuff and then asynchronously gets data and then it pulls that in and then it's rendering additional pieces, whether or not it's visual or text or what have you. Doesn't really fall into the typical application type that would be submitted as an AMP application, where AMP applications, in my opinion, are very content heavy. The idea of like pre-rendering that content with very little dynamic nature to that for the initial load. Yeah, sure, there's going to be additional interaction things, whether or not you're routing and to be able to support more of your application versus just the initial view. But the idea of having that initial view and that initial content presented in a static manner is, to me, fits into what the AMP model supports.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And probably something I should have mentioned earlier is that this really is geared towards sites that and apps that are trying to be search indexed and want to rank highly in the search rankings. And that's typically a lot of times content sites, right? Like that is a very normal thing. So yeah, I agree.
Again, as the initial starting point of interacting with that application, that you may have other interactive pieces as part of your site, but just not necessarily as part of the initial AMP load.
Yep. Yeah.
And I hope we get to talk about that because I know you're huge into this. The idea of going from, hey, here's some statically loaded stuff to switch over to be working in a dynamic manner.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to just mention about how Google then uses AMP, and then I have a couple different approaches that you can do to like better work with your Angular and AMP together in a nicer way. Okay, so that's like a basic overview of kind of what it is and a little bit of how it works, and it's worth understanding how the Google search engine then uses your applications, because as it's crawling, it sees like you specify that this is an AMP page, and it tests to make sure that it meets all the criteria, all the protocol that to be an AMP page, right? If it does, then basically it'll suck all of your content and all of your the resources associated with rendering your page into the AMP cache. So like AMP cache is actually either the Google CDN, or actually there's other pretty much any CDN can be part of the AMP cache. They need to go through a process and get approved and that type of thing. So Cloudflare actually has an approved AMP cache, and a couple other CDNs do as well. But basically, it will take that and then have it living in one of the different AMP caches. I think Google CDN by default. And then when it does not, one thing that people get wrong, just having an AMP page by itself does not mean that your site will rank higher. That's not like the signal like for it to rank higher, but it's sort of an indirect way, because the different qualities that AMP gives you does give those signals. So like the fast loading, the fast interactivity, like those things are positive signals to Google search engine that it does actually increase your ranking because of those. So in an indirect way, it does help, but not just simply because Google's trying to favor AMP or whatever else. So when someone does a search and they see your result that is an AMP page, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this on like a mobile device, it'll have that little like lightning bolt thing. So that's one thing, is that if it is an AMP page, they put a little icon there so that people know that it will load fast. In the background, there is some sort of algorithm where Google will actually like prefetch a lot of those resources. So when the user clicks on that, it should, in their browser, they should actually already have at least some, if not all, of those resources readily available, so that it just like pops right there. Now, the one thing that people complain about is that the URL, when you click on that, is a Google URL. It's not like if from Get Human, I have an AMP page, and they click on my Google search results, it doesn't go to gethuman.com. It goes to google.com/ I forget the full URL, but it's some Google URL that it's serving from, right? Now, that's like, people hate that. and it's like a big topic that a number of different issues. Number one being that like people feel that it is there's a trust thing involved there, that people click on a result and the user sees that it's not their site, and is this like a fake page? Like what's going on here? There's a lot of other concerns, but Cloudflare, actually, just to give a shout out to them, just came out with a thing to solve this that uses a whole bunch of like crazy tech that I need to look into a little bit more, but they are able to, so even though the content's being served from the Google CDN, they are actually able to show your URL, which is totally bizarre, if you guys understand what I mean. So like it'll show gethuman.com, even though all of the content is actually coming from the Google CDN. It's not coming from my servers. And so they use, I honestly need to look into it a little more, but they use this thing called web packaging, which is like, I guess, a protocol for digitally encrypting a signature for CDNs so that they are able to do this type of thing. Yeah, it's kind of wacky. And then the last thing to mention there is that, and this is another thing people complain about, is if you guys have seen the in Google search results, the carousels that they do sometimes, like they have like for news carousels or whatever. And even though Google doesn't specifically reward sites for AMP in as far as like which part in the search results they show up in, I mean, they do unfairly, some would argue, put them in the carousels because they're AMP. Now, what Google's argued with that is that because they have the AMP specification, they have a guarantee that about it. And what other people have argued against that is that if you are able to meet whatever the specifications for speed and rendering, regardless of whether it's AMP or not, they should be able to have an equal chance to get into the carousel. So I don't know for sure, but I think I've read that Google is starting to change that part of it. I think they are starting to put stuff in those carousels that are not just AMP pages, but I don't know too much about the status of that, but it is something that they're at least aware about.
So one quick question about AMP in general, because I think you're about to get towards the Angular specific side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is the AMP specification, is that a Google-owned specification, or is that a public specification?
Yeah.
Only because everything we've talked about is pretty much through Google. And then the follow-up to that is, are any other companies following this pattern with a specification if it is open?
Yeah, that is actually a really good question. And again, something I should have mentioned is that it is technically an open source specification. Like, so Google clearly started it, but they have been pushing hard to get like a lot of other companies involved in, like have like an actual committee that involves many companies outside of Google that has say in how the protocol gets developed over time and that type of thing. I don't know the details of like who else is involved right now. I haven't been keeping up with those politics, but I do know that they are trying to do that very actively because they don't want this to be just something that is a Google specific thing that they are pushing. They would like it to be more of a generalized specification that not only like other search engines, are there search engines? I guess there are, but other search engines could theoretically use, or actually no, more realistically, like something like, for Facebook or Twitter link rendering, where it actually has like the, shows that snippet when you paste a link into Twitter, let's say, that theoretically Twitter could use the same exact protocols to instantly render when the person clicks on that page, that they would be able to instantly see it. So theoretically that they don't do that right now, Twitter doesn't, but they could in the future. Okay. So let's talk about Angular. So I've tried a whole bunch of different approaches with Angular and AMP. And so I want to, and I don't necessarily think there's one that is the de facto like best way per se. There's like trade-offs for each of these, but I basically have 4 different ways that you can start to think about this. And so I'm actually giving a talk in a month at JS Mobile Conf in Boston here, talking about some of this stuff, and I'm gonna try to lay out examples for all this. So maybe I'll send you guys, I'll tweet it out for you guys too once I have that ready. But okay, let's go through. Yeah, go for it.
In terms of thinking about like this, the AMP, like if I'm building my application, my Angular application, and it's going to have this, there's a lot of stuff that's going to do, right? It's going to have routing and all that stuff. Am I thinking in terms of, okay, the initial hit of it, I want to deliver some chunk in AMP and then change it over to the full app? Or am I thinking in terms of like AMP all the way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that depends. There's just a spectrum here. And like for the kind of 4 different approaches, the answer to your question differs depending on which approach. So like, I don't think there's one way to do that. So just as an example, so for the first one, right, you can basically build a completely separate app and separate page just for your AMP stuff. So like in your de facto canonical URLs, you guys know what canonical means? Just like it's a SEO term. So like it's you might have like a number of different pages that have the same content. The canonical is the URL that is like the one that should be searching or that Google should index and point to whenever somebody searches for that thing. So you have a canonical URL of like let's say gethuman.com/Verizon. Okay, that is a particular page about Verizon stuff. What you can do is put in the header like a link tag which says like, okay, link for AMP HTML, go to this other URL. Okay, and so that other URL is essentially the same content, but it's built like 100% in AMP, like no Angular, just 100% in AMP, versus in your canonical page you aren't dealing with AMP at all, and it's just Angular. So this is like a complete separation of things, and the nice thing about doing things this way is that you don't have to worry about the integration between the two, like all those restrictions and whatever else. The bad thing is that it's like twice the work because you have to like build like it's building a completely separate page basically to do the same thing just in a different way. But it is very useful. Like the one thing where I would suggest this approach is if you didn't necessarily want to amplify like every template and every part of your app, but maybe there's like one important part that you want to make sure that's ranking really highly. So just doing the extra work for this makes sense, and so that might be like a good approach in that case, if that makes sense.
So you mentioned that's handled by a link tag inside the head element, correct?
Yeah.
So inside of a typical Angular application, you would then need to essentially have some sort of service or component that would need to drop those link tags into the head dynamically. Because I'm assuming GetHuman/Verizon is different than GetHuman/AT&T.
Yeah, and just to be clear, by link tag I don't mean an A tag. I mean like specifically like a header meta tag, like a link. But yeah, so
not an anchor tag, but the LINK.
Yeah. So for that, what I do with Angular Universal, you can basically inject the document, and like I have there's no specific service like in Angular. They have the title service and meta tag one for those types of things. For other stuff that I want to like dynamically inject into the head, I actually inject the document itself. There's a token for that you can use, and you can I don't have the code right in front of me now, but I can definitely, I'll post something about this. It's pretty straightforward to do something like that. But yeah, it would be on a per page basis that you would put some like whatever URL /AMP or however you want the AMP URL to be. So, okay, so that's one. All right, number 2. So the way to think about this one is that you're thinking in terms of the routing, and the basic part of the app is like essentially Angular Universal, which generates AMP compliant stuff for the most part. And for your clients, all your client-side stuff, you use Angular elements to generate web components that you use inside AMP script. So this is sort of the other end of the spectrum, somewhat, where you actually don't have a full client-side Angular app per se. You're basically going like full, like you're embracing AMP to completely, but you still use Angular in the bits where you can. So you use Angular Universal to like statically generate that like initial content and initial view, and then for your client-side stuff, you're building it as web components that you publish, if that makes sense. So that's approach number two. And I'm not sure, even though that approach works, this is the one that I haven't used myself really, other than just like playing around with it, because most of the time I kind of want like the full Angular on the client side or whatever. So it's kind of maybe in the future, when the Angular framework gets like better about publishing web components and some of the stuff here, it might be easier or something. I don't know. But the CSS is an issue in this case, though, just as an FYI. So like I mentioned the CSS problem before about having to inline it, like some other restrictions. So I do have a solution for that, or at least an approach rather. So the way that I have done it, which works well with AMP, is that, and actually is not that painful, to be honest. It's that you take the approach of having a couple really good global, like if you just create like essentially one CSS file that ends up being your inline CSS with all of your kind of like global classes, like CSS classes, and just like have them in like a good generic way. Like you wouldn't be able to go really specific to like on every specific page having a different class, but like all the like generalized CSS classes that you use like a whole bunch of places, you would just put in that global CSS file. And then basically everything else is using the style attribute. Like basically you use a lot of like inline styles on the actual element itself. So like I know some people like that, some people don't. Fair or whatever. But at least when you're trying to do something like this, that approach seems to work pretty well. And my only complaint, which I've tried to like doing inline styles with Angular, like I feel like can be made easier with some like additional like work on like the CSS in JS stuff, like hasn't really ever been embraced by the Angular community, I feel like, as it has in the React side. So I think that the sort of advancement of creating like good libraries around doing that type of stuff isn't really there. But maybe in the future that'll get better. So that's just
one thing in on that, because every time I use the Angular animations, and Angular animations has a helper function for doing CSS that then will do it in JS, right? Like I wanted to use that helper function and use that in the template potentially, right, to add the styles with the object thing. I wonder if we could get there with some of the stuff that's already there with the animations helper stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't tried that yet, but I think you're right. Like that would be really interesting.
Because that challenge with doing it in the template, right, with the style attribute is like, do you just do the style attribute and then feed it in this object that has all of them, or do you do individual properties in, and so wrangling that and managing that is a challenge, right? And an elegant solution to that. And like I think like you're saying is, if I could write all that in JavaScript and then have that object ready and hand it there, like like the strong typing and everything around it, right?
I mean, at the end of the day, CSS sucks. I mean, it is what it is. But no, by the way, just not to digress too much or whatever, but just because I'm remembering this, it's like a mid-show plug or whatever. I don't know if you guys saw, like I tried out Dave Geddes' Flexbox course or whatever. Like it was awesome. Like I've been avoiding because I just like a lot of the CSS stuff, and Flexbox was always something I like avoided trying to get into, and I would just like copy and paste stuff and whatever, or just trial and error until it like actually worked or whatever. But I mean, that was like one of the best courses I've ever taken, just in terms of like how, simple but like done in a really smart way. So would definitely recommend that.
That is a really cool course. Doesn't he have a grid one as well too? Like, now you got to catch up. I think there's another one.
Oh, I haven't seen the grid one. I'm gonna have to try that out too.
Yeah. So doing CSS grid.
Yeah.
Did you? The real question is like, when did you do that, and did it absorb for you so that now you know?
Yeah. So one of the things, if you did check out the course, one of the things is the goal is not just to understand the sort of concepts, but to literally get it so that you don't have to look it up anymore, that you actually just know it, that you can pull it from memory. And yeah, I literally do not look up Flexbox stuff anymore. Like when I've been messing around with it, like now I'm good. Like I can just, do it from memory. Like all the different, flex grow, flex shrink, like every little thing just makes sense. So.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. Number 3. So you can do something where you basically just do Angular Universal generating the static, AMP pages or whatever, and only load the client if it is not coming from AMP. So like if someone's trying to access the AMP page, then you don't even bother loading the client. So like it would just be, this works well. So I've used this before. This is actually the approach that we use on gethuman.com if you try to access it through a mobile app, is that basically this works well where the client side JavaScript kind of like dynamic stuff is like a value add, that like it's not essential, that so for gethuman.com, we have some like a whole bunch of extra stuff that loads and like the user can interact with. But it, because we really care strongly about ranking, and like just getting it AMP compliant was like more important than this like fun thing that the useful client side activity. In this particular case, we went with this approach, and it works great. So it's if the user goes to your page, like not through Google search results, like coming through an AMP page, then, it does the normal thing of like, the client side, loads, takes over, and goes from there, client side routing and everything else. But if it is from the Google AMP cache side of things, it's almost like you hit disable on in your browser, like disable JavaScript or whatever. So it should still show, and then user clicks around, and when they do click around, by the way, even if it's served from the Google CDN, once they click on a link, it will actually go to your gethuman.com or your actual like URL page. So it won't navigate on the Google CDN side. It's only for that initial view, if that makes sense.
So it understands what the base URL is. I mean, you can still use your relative URLs when rendering.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
It seems like there's maybe a good opportunity there for Angular Universal to have some way to, from the client side, say, okay, activate, kind of like what you're talking about. Does it have something like that?
It's funny you bring this up. So this is something that we've talked about. So I'm not as active like on the Angular Universal team as I once was, but like from time to time we do talk about this, and that is something that like I know Rob Wormald in particular has always like thought about as like the ideal, that like you have like some sort of thing on the client side that it knows when to like activate like that. So I don't think we're quite there yet, and you could probably build your own kind of like custom version of this, but I do think that it is something that at some point it will be sort of baked into Angular or something along those lines.
Yeah, because everything that you're talking about, like it feels the Universal's could be an awesome fit for this. Hey, that's the way I get the AMP version of my full-blown Angular app, so I can keep working on one code base but still provide that functionality, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Definitely.
I immediately start thinking about like, okay, if I'm building a shopping cart site, like I want those pages of the products to be this AMP experience, but I want this full shopping cart interactivity powering it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it would be both of those worlds that would be living in, and that would be the server-side rendering initial thing, getting the AMP stuff, and then the power of the app once they do stuff.
Yep, definitely. Okay, so last one. So this is the one sort of title for show. This is basically Angular AMP without AMP. Okay, so this is basically where you don't you're not technically complying with the full AMP specification, but you are in spirit. So like you're not going to be in the AMP carousel. There's a trade-off there. But basically, you are still going for the same type of idea where it is like loading, very quickly, and like you are, optimizing for that above the fold, all that type of stuff. Now, in doing this, like you could take the sort of AMP specification guidelines and build all your own stuff. But like, I don't think that's necessarily the approach that I've used a couple times where like I just want to do something quickly, but I still want to get some of the same benefits of like just the performance aspects of things, is that I just do still use the AMP web components, but I just don't, I do it as part of like my Angular app. So it's just as if you're using any other web component, right? So again, you're not, instead of like thinking of it from, this is an AMP application that you're trying to like fit in Angular to, it's sort of the reverse of it. That this is an Angular application that you're kind of like sprinkling some like pieces of like the very smart AMP web components that they built that are very performant and help you to do some of these like optimizations, very easily. So I've used this approach a lot, and this like helps. And more and more, some of the other services like Cloudflare is starting to see how, like, if you providing alternatives, basically, where you can gain like a very similar characteristics for some of the initial load times or whatever, but just not with all of the restrictions that they have, if that makes sense.
Could you see anything like maybe like native script, like that same sort of concept, but with AMP stuff, where you have like an AMP version, like as part of something that you have? And so beyond just the reusing those components, but actually like full on component creation, that's our own AMP components as part of our Angular thing.
Yeah, I mean, so you can, besides creating your own custom AMP components, like AMP compliant components, they do have a process for publishing. So if you want to like share your web components with other people that is AMP compliant, there's a process for that. And I mean, a bunch of people do that. There's like hundreds of them out there or whatever. It's just like an NPM type thing. Like there's a huge store of them that's growing continuously. So yeah, I mean that's the basic four approaches. And basically in these next couple months, I'm going to be trying to build out like specific like code examples for a lot of this, and my idea on the Angular AMP without AMP, I want to get to a point where like I have it where it's not AMP compliant, but it is like from a performance perspective, it's at par. Like that would be like the ideal.
The part again, taking that to the next level, the idea of using universal or what have you, what this says to me is they recently opened up the builders API within the Angular CLI, that if there was a build Angular AMP builder that would take all of these practices and essentially apply that throughout your build process, automatically create your web components and publish that, take all your CSS and inline your CSS and do all of those things for you as a builder. I mean, without
awesome.
the Angular framework itself, to be able to take your components, build them as web components, and apply all these practices would be an interesting concept.
All right, so here's what we're going to do with that, Mike. You're going to build that, and let me know. Actually, so I did submit an ngConf talk for some stuff, around what I'm talking about now. But I think what you're describing may be a good, add-on to that. So actually, I am going to update my submission. That I will build it. If they accept my talk for AMP, I will build that.
You heard it here first,
Yes.
folks. I like because actually Justin and I went through and submitted last night. We did that
Last night. Yeah, it was only it wasn't even like 24 hours ago.
I know I've had a rough day, but there's one of the categories for submitting is science fair project. So you might even think that whole library, that entire concept could be a science fair project.
Yeah, that's cool. Definitely. I do have a hard stop in a couple minutes, guys. So I wish we could talk about this all day, every day.
Hey, we're not worried because we'll just book you again to come back and talk more about it. People just have to wait, but I'm sure we could get you back on.
And your Twitter handle is there as well. People can reach out to you that way too.
Yep, definitely.
All right, let's do some picks real quick then. If anybody has any picks.
Jeff?
Anybody? I have some, but
no. So my one is I told everybody on Twitter that I'd give a shout out to the GDEs going to the summit this weekend. I am not able to make it, but have fun, everyone, and don't make me too jealous with fun pictures. And I'm sure they'll give you like a Google Home or something else, whatever the new gadget is. I'll miss out on.
We'll see. I'll miss you. You were my roommate last year, so
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
That was fun. All right, Mike, do you have any picks?
I'm just so excited for our stream tonight. With NGBS, we're going to be talking about creating custom RxJS operators. I'm excited for that, so tune into that.
That's cool.
I'm excited about that as well. My pick is the new Star Wars trailer because I love me some Star Wars, and I'm excited. So. Yeah, there you go. You got the shirt. Number one dad. I mean, is it really the number one dad? I mean, things kind of went south there, but
listen, hey, I've gotten it confirmed from two different people named Maddie and Angie.
Well, I have no doubt. Like, you're the number one dad. I'm just asking if Vader's like really the number one dad. Right?
Oh
yeah, for sure for you. Yeah, awesome. All right, well, that's a wrap. Hey, Jeff. Thanks a ton. Really appreciate it, as always, for you sharing your time and with us. We really appreciate it.
Cool. Have a good one, guys.
All right. See you, everyone. Later.
All right.